He was just a struggling waiter at a small, run-down diner, the kind of place where dreams go to die. Jacob's life was a constant battle, barely scraping by on minimum wage, working double shifts just to keep the lights on in his tiny apartment. Every day felt like a loop of quiet disappointment, with no end in sight. Until the night she walked in. Sophia Monroe, Hollywood's brightest star, a name that echoed in every corner of the world. She was the kind of woman people only saw on billboards, magazine covers, and red carpets, someone completely out of reach for someone like Jacob. When she stepped into that diner, her presence felt electric, as though the air itself had shifted. Heads turned, whispers filled the room. But it was Jacob she locked eyes with. Their connection was instant, almost unreal. Why was someone like her even there, let alone speaking to him? She laughed at his jokes, asked about his life, and stayed far longer than anyone expected. It was as if she saw something in Jacob that no one else did, something even he didn't believe existed. Over the next few weeks, they became inseparable, the headlines calling it the most unlikely romance of the century. Hollywood's golden girl had fallen for a broke, unknown waiter. Then came the wedding, a whirlwind ceremony that caught everyone off guard. It was intimate, magical, and Jacob couldn't believe this was his life now. For the first time in years, he felt like he had escaped the shadows of his struggles. But fairy tales have a way of masking the truth, don't they? Because just 9 days later, the dream turned into a nightmare. He stumbled upon something she had kept hidden, locked away, buried so deep that she thought no one would ever find out. But Jacob did. And what he discovered wasn't just a secret. It was a revelation so dark, so shocking. It would make him question everything he thought he knew about her, about their marriage, about the danger he might now be in. What was she hiding? And how had it gone unnoticed for so long? Was the woman he married even the person he thought she was? Jacob's life was about to unravel in ways he couldn't have imagined, and nothing could prepare him for what was coming next. He had lived a quiet, almost invisible life. A small apartment in the heart of the city, the kind where the walls were thin and the sounds of the street below served as his nightly lullaby. Each morning, Jacob would pull on the same uniform, lace up his worn shoes, and head to the downtown diner where he worked endless double shifts. The days blurred into each other, greeting regulars, cleaning up after hurried customers, and silently watching the world move on without him. His routine was his comfort, even if it wasn't much of a life. He never dared to dream of anything beyond those cracked linoleum floors and greasy tabletops. That was just who he was, quiet, hardworking, and all too aware of his place in the world. But one night, something happened that would shatter that monotony forever. The evening shift had been slow, the diner nearly empty, when the front door opened with a soft jingle. In walked a woman who seemed to bring the very air around her to a halt. She wasn't just beautiful. She was radiant, magnetic, the kind of person who turned heads without trying. It didn't take long for Jacob to realize who she was. How could he not? She was her. The star everyone talked about. The one plastered across every billboard, movie poster, and magazine cover. Hollywood's brightest light, Sophia Monroe. The kind of woman Jacob had only ever seen on screens or in the glossy pages of tabloid stories while wiping down the diner counter. But there she was, standing in front of him, larger than life yet somehow so human. There was a kindness in her smile that felt disarming, a warmth that didn't match the image of perfection that the media had painted of her. She wasn't demanding or distant like Jacob might have expected. Instead, she spoke to him like an equal, asking for a cup of coffee, laughing softly at his nervousness, and even asking about his day. In those fleeting moments, it felt as though she wasn't a star, and he wasn't just a struggling waiter. She saw something in him, something Jacob himself didn't even know was there. And he couldn't stop staring. He couldn't believe that someone like her, with her fame, her beauty, and her perfect life, would even look his way, let alone sit down at his table and talk to him. Sophia didn't act like the untouchable celebrity he had imagined. She was humble, even vulnerable. The way she looked at him made Jacob feel like, for the first time in his life, he was more than just another face in the crowd. That night, something shifted. It was as though fate had walked through the doors of that diner, and turned his entire world upside down. Jacob's quiet, predictable existence was about to change in ways he couldn't have foreseen. But as the days passed and their connection grew, the question lingered. Why him? And why now? Little did he know. The answer to those questions would unravel a truth so unsettling it would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew. It all happened so fast, it almost didn't feel real. Within days of that first meeting, Sophia and Jacob had become inseparable. What started as a simple cup of coffee in a quiet diner turned into long walks in the park, late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, and stolen moments of laughter that made the rest of the world disappear. Jacob couldn't believe it. Here he was, a man who had spent his life in the background, suddenly pulled into the spotlight by someone he had never imagined even noticing him. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed to relish the quiet, unpolished honesty that Jacob brought into her life. She wasn't just Hollywood's sweetheart when she was with him. She was simply Sophia. The world took notice almost immediately. The moment the paparazzi caught wind of their relationship, the headlines practically wrote themselves. Hollywood's golden girl falls for a broke waiter. Cameras followed their every move, from romantic dinners at cozy, hidden-away bistros to their casual strolls down city streets. The media frenzy was relentless, with some calling it a fairy tale romance and others calling it a publicity stunt. But Sophia didn't care about the headlines, the gossip, or the flashing cameras. She brushed off the rumors with the same effortless grace she carried on the red carpet. To her, Jacob represented something rare in her world, a sense of grounding, of realness. He wasn't dazzled by her fame or intimidated by her success. He saw her for who she truly was, not the version of herself crafted for the public eye. And Jacob? He was falling hard. Every smile, every touch, every look from her seemed to pull him further into a dream he never wanted to wake from. Sophia wasn't just the most beautiful woman he had ever met. She was kind, thoughtful, and full of a vulnerability that made her seem almost human. Their love story became the kind of thing movies are made of. Against all odds, they decided to tie the knot just weeks after their first meeting. The ceremony was a far cry from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. It wasn't held in a sprawling mansion or an exotic destination. Instead, it was a small, intimate gathering in a quaint garden surrounded by just a handful of close friends. Sophia wore a simple yet elegant dress, and Jacob could barely take his eyes off her. He remembered standing there, holding her hands, as she smiled at him like he was the only person in the world. In that moment, everything felt perfect. For the first time in his life, Jacob felt like he belonged somewhere, like he mattered. But as they exchanged vows and kissed beneath the warm glow of the setting sun, a small, unshakable thought lingered at the back of Jacob's mind. How could something so perfect, so incredible, happen to someone like him? He told himself it didn't matter. Fate had brought Sophia into his life, and he wasn't about to question it. The next few days felt like a dream. They spent their honeymoon away from the cameras and the chaos, tucked away in a remote cabin where they could simply be themselves. They cooked together, danced under the stars, and talked about the future, about the kind of life they wanted to build together. For Jacob, it felt like the universe had finally smiled on him. After years of struggle, he had found love, happiness, and a sense of purpose. But what he didn't know was that beneath the surface of this perfect romance, a shadow was beginning to form. Because Sophia wasn't just escaping from the chaos of Hollywood when she married Jacob. She was running from something far more dangerous. And soon, Jacob would discover a secret that would turn his dream into a nightmare. 9 days. That's how long it took for everything to unravel. In the beginning, Jacob was still living in a state of blissful disbelief. He had married the woman of his dreams, a woman who had shown him a side of life he never thought possible. Their days together were filled with laughter, passion, and plans for a future that seemed too perfect to be true. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, and Jacob didn't see it coming. It started with the little things. At first, they were easy to dismiss as nothing more than quirks of a woman with a high-profile career. The late-night phone calls, always brief and always with a look in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. She'd quickly end the conversations, offering no explanation as to who was on the other end. Then there were the sudden disappearances, moments when Sophia would slip away for hours at a time. She'd say she had business to attend to, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. There were moments when she'd return from these absences, and Jacob would sense a strange shift in her mood. A coldness, a tension, that was unlike the woman he had married. He tried not to dwell on it. After all, she was a famous actress, a woman constantly under pressure from the media, her agent, and the demands of her career. Jacob convinced himself that these were just the growing pains of a relationship caught in the whirlwind of fame. He told himself that once the dust settled, everything would be fine. After all, what could possibly be wrong? He was her world, wasn't he? But then, everything changed the day he found the envelope. It was a Sunday afternoon when it happened. Jacob had been cleaning up the house while Sophia was out on another one of her unexplained outings. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Jacob had grown used to the soft hum of life they had created together, but today there was something off. It felt as if the walls were closing in on him, pressing him into a world that no longer felt as safe as it once had. He wandered into the office, a small room off to the side of their living room, and began sorting through the clutter on the desk. That's when he saw it. A small, unassuming envelope was tucked beneath a stack of papers. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then something made him pause. There was no return address, no stamp, just a name written in bold black ink. Rachel Miller. Jacob had never heard of this name before. He tried to push the feeling aside, but curiosity got the better of him. He told himself it was nothing, just another business letter she hadn't gotten around to opening. But something deep inside him whispered that this was different. His hands trembled slightly as he tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, and scrawled across it were words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The letter was short, but its impact was devastating. It was from someone named Rachel Miller, addressed to Sophia. The contents were vague, but enough to send a chill down Jacob's spine. It spoke of arrangements, of keeping things quiet, and of ensuring no one finds out. But what struck him most was the final line. You know what will happen if they find out. You have to follow through. It's the only way. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as the words sank in. He felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. What was this about? What was Sophia hiding from him? His mind raced, replaying every moment, every odd phone call, every strange disappearance, and now this letter. Was this the reason she had been acting so distant? Was there something about her past that she hadn't told him? The letter dropped from his hands, fluttering to the floor as his thoughts spun wildly. He wanted to confront her immediately, to demand the truth, but he didn't. Part of him still held on to the belief that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just business. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was at play. He spent the next few hours pacing around the house, waiting for Sophia to return. But when she did, the smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. There was a stiffness to her that wasn't there before. It was as if she could feel the weight of the secret she had been hiding, and it was suffocating her. Jacob didn't bring up the letter. Not yet. He wanted to be sure, to have more answers, but as the night went on, he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The atmosphere between them had shifted, and Jacob could feel it. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had made him feel like the luckiest man alive, was slipping away, and in her place was someone who was running from something. Something that could destroy everything they had built. That night, as they lay in bed, Jacob found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His mind wouldn't let go of the letter, of the mystery it held. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more sinister beneath the surface? His heart told him he needed to confront her, to find out the truth once and for all, but his head screamed at him to wait. Whatever it wasn't ready to be revealed. But how long could he wait? The clock ticked on, each second stretching into eternity, as Jacob wondered just how much of the woman he loved he truly knew. And more importantly, what would happen when the truth finally came to light? It wasn't just one secret. It was a web of lies that stretched far beyond what Jacob could have ever imagined. The more he uncovered, the deeper he sank into a dark truth, a truth that shook the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about Sophia. At first, it was just a letter, a mysterious letter that seemed like it could be explained away. But Jacob's instincts told him this was only the tip of the iceberg. The letter had mentioned a name, Rachel Miller, but that was just the start. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that nothing about Sophia was as it seemed. Jacob spent the next few days in a daze, caught between disbelief and a growing sense of dread. He began searching through every corner of their home, desperate for answers. He searched the drawer where he had found the letter, hoping there was something more, something that could explain it all. That's when he found the first photograph. It was tucked behind a stack of old receipts, just out of sight. A photograph of Sophia, younger, standing next to a man who looked eerily familiar. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing eyes. The name written on the back of the photograph was Michael Monroe, a name Jacob had seen before, but not in a context he could recall. As he tried to piece together the fragments of this mystery, the name Michael Monroe kept appearing in his thoughts, but it wasn't until he searched online that the horrifying truth began to take shape. Michael Monroe was Sophia's brother. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Michael Monroe had been involved in a high-profile scandal years ago, a scandal that had rocked Hollywood to its core. It was a tragic story that had been splashed across the tabloids. Michael Monroe was accused of being involved in a brutal crime, one that had left a trail of destruction in its wake. The details were hazy. The press had been careful to avoid specifics, but the headlines told a story of betrayal, manipulation, and revenge. Jacob couldn't believe what he was reading. How had Sophia been involved in all of this? How could the woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with his heart, be connected to such a dark past? It wasn't long before Jacob's search led him to a few key facts that sent chills down his spine. Michael Monroe had disappeared shortly after the scandal, vanishing without a trace. No one knew where he had gone or what had happened to him. The case had been quietly buried, with only a few whispers from the underworld suggesting that he had gotten involved with dangerous people, people who didn't care about his fame or his family name. The tragedy that had struck their family had been far-reaching, and Sophia had been at the center of it all. Jacob's mind reeled. This was what she had been hiding, a past filled with manipulation, deceit, and a scandal that could ruin her career. But there was more. Jacob began to uncover even darker details, the kinds of secrets that had been buried so deep that even the press had failed to catch wind of them. As he sifted through old records and online articles, he found an unsettling connection to a criminal syndicate, one that had been linked to Michael Monroe before his disappearance. The syndicate was known for its ruthless methods, dealing in everything from blackmail to organized crime. And it seemed that Sophia, too, had been caught in their web. It was as if her entire life had been a carefully constructed facade, a mask to hide the truth about her involvement in a world that no one could have ever imagined. One evening, Jacob confronted her. He'd found enough to fill in the gaps, but he still needed to hear the truth from her. He didn't know if he was ready for the answer, but the lies were suffocating him, eating away at the love he had once felt. He watched as Sophia's face slowly changed when he brought up her past, her eyes clouding over, the warmth she once had replaced by an icy coldness. Her smile, her beautiful, reassuring smile, faded, and for the first time, Jacob saw a side of her he didn't recognize. Sophia sat him down, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're asking," she said, her words tinged with fear. "You don't understand the world I've been running from." She went on, telling him of her past, of the darkness that had followed her for years. She confessed that she had been involved with Michael's dealings, coerced into it, trapped by the very people who had destroyed her family's reputation. She had tried to leave it all behind, to build a new life with Jacob, but it had never been that simple. The past, she explained, never truly lets go. There were debts, favors owed, and dangerous people lurking in the shadows, always watching. Jacob's heart broke as he listened to her story, each word a dagger in the gut. The woman he had fallen in love with wasn't the person he thought she was. She wasn't just a woman trying to make a life for herself. She was a woman running from a past filled with betrayal, violence, and guilt. But as she spoke, Jacob realized that her fear wasn't just about her past. There was something else, something even darker, that she wasn't telling him. The shadows that had been haunting her life weren't just about escaping the criminal world. They were about survival. Sophia's eyes welled up with tears as she told him about the threats she had received, the dangers that still followed her. The men from Michael's world weren't finished with her. They wanted something she had kept hid for years. And now that she had married Jacob, they were targeting him too, using him as leverage to force Sophia into their grasp. The love they had shared, the life they had built, it was all part of the trap. Jacob was faced with an impossible choice: to turn his back on the woman he loved, the woman who had lied to him, or to fight alongside her against the dark forces that had already cost her so much. It was a choice no one should have to make, and in that moment, Jacob realized just how deep the darkness ran. Confronting Sophia wasn't easy. Jacob had spent countless nights wrestling with his thoughts, trying to piece together the puzzle of her life. He thought he knew her. He thought their love was built on trust, on something real. But now, standing in front of her, with the letter burning a hole in his pocket, everything he thought he knew about her was crumbling away. Sophia was seated on the couch, her face pale, her hands trembling as Jacob walked in, holding the envelope in his hand. The room felt suffocating, too small for the weight of the truth that was about to come crashing down. She knew what was coming. Her eyes, once filled with affection and warmth, now looked distant, as if she had already resigned herself to the inevitable. Jacob didn't speak at first. He couldn't. The words were stuck in his throat, caught between disbelief and rage. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, the silence between them thick with tension. Finally, his voice broke through the stillness. "Who is Michael Monroe?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia's eyes widened for a moment before she quickly dropped her gaze to the floor. She knew he had found the letter. She knew this moment was coming. And still, her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For the first time, Jacob saw fear in her eyes. Not the fear of an actress facing the pressures of fame, but the kind of fear that only someone who had been hiding the darkest secrets could know. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap as she looked up at him, her voice shaking. "I never wanted you to find out," she said, her voice soft and fragile. "I didn't want to drag you into this world, my world. But I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought we could have a normal life, a life away from everything that came before us." Jacob took a step closer, his anger and confusion rising in his chest like an uncontrollable storm. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "You told me you loved me. You told me we could have everything together. But now you're hiding a past filled with lies and betrayal. What else have you been lying about? What else haven't you told me?" Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, Jacob saw her vulnerability, the cracks in her perfect facade. She had always been the picture of composure, the actress who controlled every situation. But now, standing before him, she was anything but composed. She was broken, fragile, and completely exposed. "I wasn't always who you thought I was," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not the person you fell in love with. I had to become someone else to survive. I made choices I regret, things I can never undo, things I can't escape from." Jacob's hands were shaking now, the letter still clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. She wasn't the woman he had married. She wasn't the woman he thought he knew. And yet, there was still something in her eyes that made him hesitate, something that told him this was no simple performance, no act she was putting on to manipulate him. This was real, this pain, this fear. It was raw, and it was coming from her heart. But then the doubt crept in. Was it all just another act? Had she learned to manipulate him too, just like she had manipulated everyone else? He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the woman he had loved, the woman he had married, was still there beneath the layers of deceit and fear. But the truth, the harsh, unforgiving truth, was too much to ignore. Sophia looked up at him, her face etched with sorrow and regret. "Jacob, please. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted a chance at a life without the shadows of my past. But now I see. I see I've dragged you into the darkness with me, and I don't know if I can ever make it right." The room fell silent again, the weight of her confession hanging between them like a thick fog. Jacob's mind raced, his emotions torn between love and betrayal, between wanting to believe her and knowing that some things couldn't be undone. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with everything, had turned out to be someone he couldn't even recognize. Could he forgive her? Could he look past the lies, the secrets, and the darkness that had followed her like a shadow? Or was this the end? Was the fairy tale romance he had once believed in nothing more than a shattered illusion? As he stood there, staring into her tear-filled eyes, Jacob realized that this moment would change everything. No matter the choice he made, nothing would ever be the same again. And in the silence that followed, he knew that the woman sitting before him had just revealed the deepest, darkest part of her soul. But was that enough for him to forgive her? Or was it too late to turn back? Jacob had made up his mind. The emotional weight of the past few days had been too much to bear. He thought he finally understood Sophia's secret, her twisted past, the betrayal, the manipulation. But as the night wore on, the shadows grew longer, and everything began to unravel in a way he couldn't have foreseen. At first, it seemed like a finality. Sophia had told him everything, or so it seemed. She had begged for forgiveness, pleading for a chance to make things right, but Jacob couldn't ignore the feeling that something was still off. The words she spoke seemed rehearsed, almost too perfect, as if she had planned her confession meticulously. He told himself it was just the stress of the past week, playing tricks on his mind. But then, as they sat in silence, trying to make sense of the devastation, a new piece of the puzzle revealed itself. Jacob had been left alone in the living room after the confrontation. His mind was still racing, his heart torn between love and betrayal. He couldn't stop replaying every conversation, every moment he had shared with Sophia, trying to find clues he had missed. His eyes wandered to a small table by the door, where an old photo album sat, one they hadn't looked at in weeks. It was a gift from her, filled with pictures of Sophia's life before they met. He opened the album, thumbing through its pages, each photo a reminder of the woman he thought he knew. But then, his fingers froze on one particular page. The photo was old, much older than the others. It was a picture of Sophia, smiling in front of a house he didn't recognize, and standing next to her, a man who was strangely familiar. Jacob's blood ran cold as he realized where he had seen him before. It was the same man who had been named in the envelope, the one from the tragedy. But this man was not just a stranger. He had been part of a scandal, something that had rocked the city years ago. A figure associated with power, corruption, and danger. The more Jacob stared at the photo, the more it gnawed at him. It wasn't just a tragic event from Sophia's past. No, this man was involved in something far darker, something Jacob had no way of understanding at the time. He stood up, the album slipping from his hands as his heart raced. The front door creaked open, and Sophia walked in, her face pale. She stopped short when she saw the photo album on the floor, and her eyes immediately narrowed. "Jacob, no!" she whispered, her voice trembling. But it was too late. Jacob had seen enough. He turned to her, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "You lied to me, Sophia. This isn't just some past you're running from. This is something deeper. Something you've been hiding all along." Sophia stepped back, her face draining of color. Her eyes darted to the door behind her, as if considering whether to run or to face what was coming. And then, the final, most chilling realization hit Jacob. There was something in her eyes, something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. A coldness, a darkness that he had been blind to until now. As he reached for his phone, ready to call for help, Sophia's voice dropped to a whisper. "You don't understand. You never will." Before he could respond, she lunged for him, her hand reaching out to stop him from calling anyone. Jacob backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of everything she had hidden. Everything that had been buried beneath the surface, now surfacing in a way that was more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. The last thing Jacob saw before everything went black was Sophia's face. But it wasn't the face of the woman he loved. It was the face of someone else entirely, someone dangerous. The truth had finally come to light. But in doing so, it had exposed a terrifying reality. Jacob's safety had never been guaranteed. And the woman he married was far from the person he thought he knew. What would you do if someone you loved kept a secret this dark? Would you confront them? Or walk away, never looking back? Let us know in the comments below. Your thoughts might just surprise us. And if you're hooked on stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The truth is always darker than you think.